Right, excellent. Okay, so I've spent the first half of this presentation really talking about trying to identify and understand crime problems. I'm going to assume that a lot of you are coming to this forum or thinking about your application because, as I said before, you've probably got a crime problem in mind. So I'm going to skip ahead and start talking about the evidence around what works. And in terms of some of the things that you might need to consider in terms of actually developing your response. But also, more importantly, in the case of those of you who have a response already in mind, the evidence and the thinking you need to show in terms of your application around this, the rationale for your response. So what evidence have you got in support of it, and what can you provide that will help demonstrate that your response is likely to be effective in addressing the crime problem that you're seeking funding for? So we've all seen something along these lines. This is from our National Crime Prevention Framework, which says effective crime prevention involves the practical application of evidence or research and evaluation and so on in developing an effective response. But it's actually the last few words there that are really important, which is about adapting that evidence to suit your particular problem and the local conditions. And so this is something I really want to talk through is actually how do you adapt an effective crime prevention response to a local problem. So not just knowing what's effective, but will it work where you're trying to implement your response, and hopefully provide you with some guidance that'll enable you to kind of demonstrate the applicability of the sorts of things you might be seeking funding for, CCTV, lighting and CPTED, in terms of addressing the problem in your council area. Okay, so I mentioned at the beginning the overwhelming evidence that says these things work. That's absolutely true. So John Eck and Rob Garrett in 2012 did a fairly large review of the evidence around situational crime prevention, and what they showed was that overwhelmingly the evidence was that these responses work and they reduce crime. Overall, they looked at something like 150 studies and they said about 3/4 were effective in reducing crime. And more importantly, all of the responses, irrespective of the type of intervention that was used, was more likely to work than not in terms of reducing crime. You'll see the results are slightly poorer for CCTV and lighting. Now, there's a really good reason for that, and that's because those two responses have been subjected to much higher quality evaluation than the others. They've been more often evaluated and evaluated using more rigorous methods. And one of the kind of paradoxes of good evaluation is that the better you evaluate something, the more likely you are to find it didn't work. And that holds true for pretty much any intervention. So that's why rigorous evaluation is so important. And there's a lot of lessons from that CCTV and lighting that I'll go through in terms of working out why it didn't work in those situations and where it may actually work and where it is effective. I mentioned briefly, and I was just having a conversation about the implications in terms of displacement from these sorts of responses. So the overwhelming evidence is that you can do CPTED, you can put in CCTV, you can put in lighting, street redesign, access control. These things work, but do they just move crime elsewhere? And now it's probably more complicated than I gave the impression earlier when I talked about displacement, but the systematic reviews that have been done show that overall the net effect is not one of displacement from these responses, but one of diffusion of benefit to surrounding areas. The important point, though, is it's a little bit more complicated than that. Displacement can occur and you need to plan for it. You need to think about it. You need to think about what could potentially happen to the surrounding areas or other similar locations in your local area. But generally speaking, what happens is if there is a displacement to those areas, the displacement will be less than the reduction in crime that you observe in your particular target location. So as I said, it's a little more complicated. And there's some really good examples of this. So we've just completed a study looking at public housing, crime prevention in public housing, and a community development strategy which involves some CPTED, some community development. What we saw there was a reduction in violent crime and a diffusion of benefit to the surrounding areas in terms of reduction of violent crime, and that was because of the kind of community cohesion that had been built on at the public housing area. What we saw, however, was that property crime and drug crime didn't go down; actually displaced to other public housing areas in the estate. So it's kind of a mixed result. And another really good example I was just talking about with someone briefly is what's going on in New South Wales with licensed premises. So what they've seen as a result of the restrictions around King's Cross and all the things that have gone on there, they've seen some displacement of violence to the casino, and they've also seen some displacement of violence to Newtown, which is another entertainment precinct. But that violence is less than what was occurring in King's Cross. So the overall effect is positive. The difficulty is trying to tell people in Newtown that the overall effect was positive when for them violence has gone up. So it is a little bit more complicated than that, and you need to plan for it. You need to think about where displacement might occur. But the point of not targeting a particular location because displacement is not the case. So just thought I think that's a really important message to take away, and particularly if that issue is raised. But demonstrating that you're thinking about displacement in your application would probably be a really important thing to do. I mentioned about some of these responses earlier in terms of trying to reduce fear of crime and improving perceptions of safety. And there's some good evidence, again, that these things can be effective in making people feel safer. A review that was completed by Theo Laurent and some others around about the same time as John Eck's review looked at very similar sorts of responses and whether they've been effective in reducing crime. Overwhelmingly, the strongest evidence was actually around access control in terms of the rigour of the evidence and SEPTED, although the percentages are a little bit all over the place. That was where the strongest evidence was in terms of reducing fear of crime. Lighting the evidence was good, but it was poor quality in terms of the evaluation design. But in terms of kind of design of public places, there's some evidence there that they can actually reduce fear of crime. They just require different sorts of responses and different sorts of interventions within that broad category of what SEPTED is and what lighting is than what might actually reduce crime. So it's about thinking a little bit differently about what particular problem you're dealing with. So, and I'll unpack this a little bit in relation to some of these responses. The problem though here is that the overall evidence base is not as strong as the evidence in terms of reducing crime. So this requires a lot more thought around, okay, well, in the absence of evidence, what do I need to do to prove that what I'm trying to do in terms of my response, what I'm trying to implement could potentially reduce fear of crime? And I'll try and unpack and give you some advice around that as well. So the question, and I mentioned this at the beginning, but the really important thing, if you take nothing else away from this, is not does something work, but what works for whom in what circumstances. You've probably heard this before. There's a lot of talk about this in terms of evidence-based policy generally, but it's this idea that you can't just pick up a pre-packaged intervention, drop it in your local setting, and it'll work the same way it worked elsewhere. And so what I'm going to do is unpack some of that for you here. But the important point, and I'm not going to talk about theory. I'm going to mention theory once, and I'm going to move on. The important thing is theory. Now, what I mean by that is, how does something work? How does what you're doing actually influence crime? What are the things that are happening? When you put CCTV in place, how does that actually make people less likely to offend or make crime less likely to occur? And you need to understand that, because that's what's important when you're trying to implement your response locally. And that's what we mean when we say what works when and for whom and in what circumstances. And we'll go through that. So when we say you need to be evidence-based, that's really important, but there's some other things you need to be able to demonstrate that you've considered as well. So you need to be able to say, well, is your intervention supported by evidence? That could be yes, there's evidence. If you're ignoring the evidence that exists and doing it anyway, that's probably a problem. You can say that the evidence doesn't exist, and that's fine if that's true, but then you need to demonstrate the other things. Oh, I lied. So I think I'm going to talk about theory twice. The other thing is theory, and is it the right thing to do? Does it theoretically make sense? Is the way in which your particular project likely to work, is that going to suit where you're implementing it? You need to think about implementation. Can you do it properly? If you're going to put in place CCTV, install it, can you actually do it? Can you install CCTV in the location that you think you want to install it? Will it work in the way you said it's going to work? And are there particular things that you might, or barriers that you might come up against? Does it address the problem and its causes? And are there other things that might influence the effectiveness of your response? Are there other things going on that you might need to consider in terms of whether CCTV, lighting, SEPTED, whatever it is that you're doing, whether it might work? So it's really important to kind of think broadly. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, you might have come across the 25 situational crime prevention techniques. And this is the idea that crime in places can be reduced by five simple mechanisms. Five simple mechanisms. You can either increase the effort through which people can commit crime, increase the risk that they'll be caught, reduce the rewards associated with committing crime, reduce provocations, or remove excuses. And then within that, there's a whole bunch of different ways in which you can influence crime. It's a really nice way of thinking about what the kind of underlying mechanism behind a response might be. So as I said, there's 25 different techniques, and this is all in those problem-solving guides that I talked about earlier. But it's the idea that, for example, you see assist natural surveillance. That's one particular mechanism out of 25 that you can use to influence crime in a location. You might be about assisting natural surveillance. You might find a way of designing a space that avoids groups coming together and in creating conflict or stress, right? So it's about designing a place to kind of influence potential conflict. You might have place managers, people who are responsible for looking after a place, which can actually manage that place and reduce the opportunities for people to commit crime, kind of capable guardians idea. So there's lots of different mechanisms through which you can actually influence crime. And this all makes sense when I start connecting these to different responses, so bear with me. Now, before I go on, there's some really useful resources that I'd encourage you to look at, and they're really, really useful in terms of some of the public safety infrastructure projects that you're going to be seeking funding for, in terms of demonstrating the evidence in support of your application. Again, the links will be in the online version. Probably the one I'd direct you to most is the Crime Reduction Toolkit. This is a brand new thing from the UK, and it's developed by the UK College of Policing and some other partners. And the really useful thing about that is it tells you what the evidence is around some of these responses, particularly CCTV and lighting. But it doesn't just tell you that, it tells you where it works, what you need to make it work, whether it's cost effective, and some of the other considerations about how these particular responses work. So I'd strongly encourage you to look at that if you haven't seen it already. Another is kind of the American version, which is Crime Solutions. What's really nice about that particular website is it does the same thing. It gives you the same overall results and the same overall information, but it also gives you the individual evaluations and the individual information about particular programs that can be really useful in trying to understand whether what you're doing is going to work. Another American site, but one that's really useful as well, is the Problem-Oriented Policing website. Pop Centre website. Now, it is targeted at police, but most of what they are implementing, most of the guides that are available there are not actually just about policing responses, about all sorts of responses. The important thing is not just the evidence, but it's the how to do it stuff. It's another really useful resource from understanding what you need to do in terms of implementing a particular response. And it organises it around response types, but also problems. So if you've got a particular crime problem, you can pretty much find it from the list, and there'll be a guide that actually tells you how to work through analysing and responding to that problem. So it's quite useful in terms of taking a slightly different approach, and I'd encourage you to look at that. And of course, a plug for the Community Crime Prevention's website. There's some really nice examples of previously funded work on their resources page. I'm going to talk about one shortly, but some of the more kind of inspiration around ideas that you could actually implement with the funding that they've provided previously, and some of the other resources. I think there's some copies out the front, but there's some resources there available to help you thinking around what you're doing as well. So there's some, as I say, some really, really good resources you can look at that will kind of provide you this sort of information that I'm going to go through briefly now. Okay, so I'm going to start with CCTV, and I'm going to talk about lighting and CPTED. So first of all, how is CCTV supposed to prevent crime? I'm going to talk about CCTV in a number of different ways: prevention, investigation, and perceptions of safety.